Hello everyone, welcome to Contemplate Life. Here, we share real-life stories, heartfelt confessions, and meaningful lessons drawn from everyday experiences. Each story is a quiet reflection on life, love, and human emotions. Now, take a deep breath, relax your mind, and let us begin our journey together.
I used to think loneliness arrived with noise, with arguments, with slammed doors or raised voices. I didn't expect it to arrive on a quiet evening, inside a warm house, surrounded by people who technically belonged to me. It was New Year's Eve. The house was full. Lights were strung along the windows. Music played softly from a speaker in the living room. Laughter moved easily from one conversation to another, as if the air itself knew where it was welcome. I was sitting on the corner of the sofa, my hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had already gone cold. My name is Margaret. I am 66 years old. And that night, I realized something I had been avoiding for months. I had not come to live with my son to feel safe. I had come to disappear quietly. Outside, fireworks were starting to crackle in the distance. Inside, my son and his wife were preparing glasses for midnight. Their movements were efficient, familiar, like two people who had learned how to live without interruption. They spoke over the music, laughing at something I hadn't heard the beginning of. I smiled when our eyes met. They smiled back, briefly, kindly, then they turned toward each other again. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel mistreated. I felt irrelevant. A year earlier, I had sold my small house in a nearby town after my husband passed away. It had been practical, sensible. The stairs were becoming difficult, the silence unbearable. My son, Daniel, suggested I come live with them in London. He said it made sense, that it would be easier for everyone, that family should be together. I believed him. That night, as the countdown to midnight began on the television, I watched my granddaughter sit on the floor with sparklers, her face lit with excitement. I watched my daughter-in-law pour champagne for guests who were arriving just in time. I noticed how naturally everyone moved around me, careful not to trip over my feet, careful not to include me in a way that would require adjustment. 10 seconds to midnight. Everyone stood. I stayed seated. Not because I couldn't stand, but because no one looked at me when they did. When the room erupted in cheers, embraces, clinking glasses, I joined in a second too late. I raised my cup of tea slightly, unsure who it was meant for. My son hugged his wife. Someone shouted, "Happy New Year." Someone else turned up the music. No one noticed I was still sitting there. And in that moment, something settled in my chest with a quiet certainty. I had crossed into a stage of life where presence no longer guaranteed belonging. Where being included depended not on love, but on convenience. I smiled to myself, the way older people do when they realize a truth they can't yet name out loud. And I wondered how many nights like this I would endure before admitting what I had already begun to feel. After that night, the shape of my life became easier to name once I stopped pretending it was temporary. Daniel is my only son. He is 41 now, a civil engineer by training, practical by nature, the kind of man who believes problems can be solved if you organize them properly. He lives with his wife, Claire, and their daughter, Sophie, in a semi-detached house on the outskirts of London. It is a comfortable home by most standards. Not extravagant, but stable. A mortgage that is manageable. 2 cars. A small garden that is kept neat without much effort. Claire is 38. She works in marketing for a mid-sized firm. She is efficient, composed, and deeply invested in structure. Her life runs on schedules and clear boundaries. She is not unkind. In fact, she is unfailingly polite. But her politeness has edges. It keeps things orderly. It keeps emotions contained. I have learned that warmth, for her, is something that must be intentional. Sophie is 10, bright, curious, always moving. She loves music and spends most evenings practicing piano in the living room. She calls me grandma and kisses my cheek before bed. She does not avoid me, but she does not seek me out either. Children adapt quickly to the emotional climate they are raised in. When my husband died 3 years ago, Daniel worried about me living alone. I was still independent, but grief has a way of hollowing out ordinary days. He suggested I sell the house and move in with them. It sounded reasonable, sensible. He framed it as a solution that benefited everyone. Less isolation for me, more family time, shared responsibility. Financially, I contribute. My pension covers my personal expenses, and I transfer money monthly toward household costs. It is not insignificant, but it is never discussed openly. Money in that house is quiet, managed, not emotional. Claire keeps the accounts. Daniel trusts her completely. I have my own room, a small one at the end of the hallway. It was once a guest room. Now it is mine. Nothing has been said, but I am careful not to change it too much. I keep my belongings contained. I do my laundry separately. I make myself useful without being asked. Cooking occasionally, babysitting when requested, staying out of the way the rest of the time. This is where the conflict began. Not with cruelty, with accommodation. Claire values independence, privacy, emotional self-sufficiency. She believes adults should manage themselves and not rely too heavily on others. She has never said this directly to me, but it appears in small ways. In how plans are made without consulting me. In how conversations pause when I enter the room. In how affection is reserved for nuclear family moments. Daniel sits between us. He loves me, I know that, but he avoids discomfort instinctively. When tension appears, he smooths it over instead of addressing it. He believes time will fix what conversation might complicate. He believes harmony comes from endurance. I come from a different understanding. I was married for 40 years. I built a life around shared space, shared meals, shared silence. I do not expect to be central anymore, but I did not expect to become invisible. There are no dramatic arguments in this house. No raised voices, no accusations. There is only a gradual narrowing of space. A subtle message repeated often enough that it begins to feel like truth. You are welcome, but you are not essential. Looking back, I can see why this arrangement was fragile from the start. A woman shaped by independence sharing space with a generation that values boundaries. A son caught between loyalty and comfort. A mother aging into a role that modern family life does not quite know how to hold. Nothing here was destined to explode loudly. It was always going to crack quietly. The first signs did not announce themselves as conflict. They arrived as adjustments, minor corrections, the kind of things you tell yourself are reasonable, especially when you are a guest in someone else's home, even if that home now carries your name in its paperwork. It started with schedules. Dinner times shifted without discussion. At first, I assumed it was temporary. Work ran late. Sophie had piano lessons. Claire was trying a new routine. I would sit in my room and listen to plates being set downstairs. Voices moving easily through the kitchen. Sometimes someone would knock on my door and say, "We're eating now, just in case you wanted to join." Other times, no one did. I learned to tell the difference by sound alone. When I did join them, the conversation often continued as if I hadn't arrived. Not intentionally, just naturally. They spoke about colleagues I didn't know. Deadlines I didn't understand. School matters already decided. I nodded. I smiled. I ate quietly. Once, when I mentioned that I used to cook a particular dish Daniel loved as a child, Claire smiled politely and said, "Oh, he's changed so much since then." It wasn't cruel. It wasn't sharp. But it closed something I hadn't realized was open. Then there were the comments. Lightly delivered, almost conversational. "You don't have to wait up for us," Claire said one evening when I stayed in the kitchen too long. "You should rest more," she said another time, when I offered to help clean up. "Don't worry about Sophie's homework. We've got a system." Each sentence was sensible on its own. Together, they formed a pattern, a gentle narrowing of responsibility. Of relevance. Daniel noticed some of it. I could tell by the way he would occasionally glance at me, then look away again. Once, when Claire reminded me that the washing machine ran best if loads were done on weekends only, he said, "Mom's always been good at managing these things." Claire nodded, but repeated the rule anyway. I said nothing. I reminded myself that I was 66. That I had lived a full life. That I did not need to be consulted on every decision. That adapting was part of staying close. Silence felt like maturity. The comparisons came next. Not direct comparisons, not cruel ones, just observations framed as compliments. Claire would mention how her own mother lived independently well into her 70s. How she traveled, how she never wanted to burden anyone. She said these things casually, often while doing something else, as if they weren't meant to land anywhere in particular. I smiled and said that sounded wonderful. Inside, something tightened. Sophie began to mirror the household's rhythm. She stopped asking me to help with piano practice. She stopped bringing her drawings into my room. When I asked her about her day, she answered kindly, briefly, then drifted back toward her parents. Children follow gravity. I did not blame her. One afternoon, I overheard Claire on the phone with a friend. She was standing in the hallway, unaware that my door was slightly open. "It's fine," she said. "She's nice. Just older habits. You know how it is. We're adjusting." I closed my door quietly. That evening, Daniel asked if everything was all right. I told him it was. He seemed relieved. Relief, I learned, is often mistaken for resolution. The house began to feel smaller in ways that had nothing to do with space. I started waking earlier so I wouldn't be in the kitchen when Claire was rushing. I ate lunch in my room more often. I adjusted my television volume lower than necessary. I took walks longer than needed. One night, during a family gathering, someone asked Claire how she managed everything. Work, parenting, household. Claire laughed and said, "It helps when everyone pulls their weight." She glanced at me, just briefly, then she smiled. I laughed too, a second too late. Daniel didn't notice, or maybe he did, and chose not to. Later, while we were clearing up, Claire said, "You don't need to do that. We're not that traditional." She said it lightly, like a joke, but I heard what sat underneath. My gestures belonged to another era, another expectation, another way of taking up space. I began to question my instincts, to hesitate before speaking, to filter my thoughts for relevance. I told myself this was what compromise looked like. That peace required restraint. On New Year's Day, I found myself sitting alone again, this time in the afternoon light. Sophie and her parents were upstairs, laughing over a board game. I could hear the dice rolling. Someone cheering. I stayed where I was, hands folded in my lap, waiting for an invitation that never came. I didn't feel angry. I felt managed. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized something quietly devastating. No one was pushing me away. They were simply arranging their lives as if I were already on the margins. And I was cooperating. The warning signs were not loud enough to demand action. Not yet. They were soft enough to justify endurance. Soft enough to convince me that silence was the price of staying. So I stayed quiet. I told myself this was temporary. That love didn't always look like inclusion. That being tolerated was better than being alone. I didn't yet understand that this was how loneliness begins to feel acceptable. And once that happens, it doesn't need permission to stay. The moment everything became impossible to ignore arrived disguised as practicality. It came through a conversation about paperwork. Daniel brought it up one evening after dinner, his tone careful, almost rehearsed. Claire was sitting beside him, scrolling through her phone, half listening. Sophie had already gone upstairs. The house was quiet in that particular way that makes ordinary sentences feel heavier than they should. "Mum," Daniel said, "we've been talking about the future. Just planning ahead." I nodded. Planning always sounded reasonable, responsible. He explained that with me living there permanently now, it might make sense to formalize a few things. Medical directives, emergency contacts, and then, after a pause that stretched slightly too long, he mentioned the house. Not this house, he clarified, the one I had sold. The proceeds, he said, had been sitting in my account untouched. He asked whether I had thought about what I wanted to do with them long term. Whether it might be safer to move the money somewhere more structured. Claire looked up then. She smiled, not warmly, efficiently. "We're not talking about taking anything from you," she said quickly. "It's just about security, making sure everything is clear. For Sophie, for everyone. For everyone." I felt the room narrow. They talked about care costs. About what happens if my health declines. about how unpredictable the system can be. Claire mentioned a colleague whose mother had needed residential care unexpectedly. The fees had been enormous. The family had been unprepared. Daniel said he just wanted peace of mind. No one asked what I wanted. I listened. I nodded occasionally. I asked a few neutral questions. Inside, something began to surface that I had kept submerged for months. A realization that all the small adjustments, the silences, the polite exclusions, had been leading here, to a moment where my presence required justification. I asked what they were suggesting. Daniel hesitated. Claire answered. She said it might make sense to contribute the remaining funds toward the house. Not as a gift, as an investment, something that could be reflected appropriately in future arrangements. It would simplify things, remove uncertainty. I understood immediately what was being proposed, even though no one said it outright. Security, in exchange for control. I felt a strange calm settle over me. Not acceptance, clarity. I asked if this was a condition for me staying. Daniel protested immediately. Of course not. That wasn't what they meant. Claire said no one was pressuring me, that this was just a conversation. But conversations don't arrive preloaded with conclusions unless they've been had already. I said I needed time to think. That night, sleep avoided me. I lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of the house. The hum of the boiler. A car passing outside. Claire's footsteps overhead. I thought about the life I had lived before this. The house I had chosen. The independence I had traded for proximity. I realized that my safety here had always been conditional. Not on love, on compliance. The next day, Susan visited. She hadn't been around much since I moved in. Her relationship with Claire was polite but distant. Still, she arrived unannounced, carrying a bag of groceries and a sense of authority that filled the kitchen without effort. She asked how I was settling in. I said fine. She nodded, unconvinced. Over tea, she mentioned that Daniel had spoken to her, that he was worried about me, about my future, about making sure everything was handled properly. Susan had always been direct. She said she thought it was wise to plan, that at my age, clarity was kindness, that families function best when expectations are explicit. Then she said something that struck deeper than she intended. You don't want to be a burden later. The word hung in the air. I smiled politely. I said nothing. She continued, explaining that she had seen too many situations become complicated when money and care weren't clearly arranged. That I should consider how much I wanted to rely on my son. That contributing financially might help maintain balance. Balance. When she left, I sat alone at the kitchen table and stared at my hands. I thought about how carefully I had tried not to inconvenience anyone. How I had measured my presence. How I had turned myself into a manageable shape. And still, it wasn't enough. That afternoon, Sophie came home from school unusually quiet. When I asked her what was wrong, she hesitated, then said her friend's grandmother lived alone and traveled a lot. She asked me why I lived with them instead. The question was innocent. The timing was not. I told her people make different choices. She nodded, then said, Mummy says it's easier when things are simple. Simple. That evening, Daniel asked if I'd had time to think. I told him yes. I said I understood their concerns. I said I appreciated that they wanted to plan ahead. Then I said I was not comfortable tying my independence to financial contribution or future promises. I said I needed clarity too, about whether I was welcome as I was, not as a resource. The room went still. Claire's expression tightened. She said I was misinterpreting things, that no one saw me that way, that I was making it emotional. Daniel looked torn. He said I was reading too much into it, that this was just adulthood, just practicality. I asked him if he would have asked the same thing if I were a guest, or if I were younger, or if I had less money. He didn't answer. That was my answer. I realized then that I was standing at a crossroads I had been approaching slowly. Step by careful step, one path led to continued quiet endurance, to security that came at the cost of agency, to a life where my place depended on staying agreeable. The other path was uncertain, lonelier, but mine. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply said I needed to leave. Not immediately, but soon. Daniel looked shocked. Claire looked relieved before she could stop herself. I said I would find a place of my own. Smaller, manageable. I said I would not be an arrangement to be managed. No one argued. Not really. Daniel tried to soften it. Claire suggested we revisit the conversation later. Susan called that night and told me I was being rash. I listened. I thanked them for their concern. But something had already shifted. For the first time since moving into that house, I felt the weight lift slightly from my chest. Not because the future was clear, but because the choice was. The explosion everyone had been avoiding did not come with shouting or tears. It came with recognition. I could stay and disappear politely. Or I could leave and remain myself. And in that moment, sitting quietly in the room that had never fully been mine, I knew which cost I was no longer willing to pay. The confrontation arrived the evening I told them I had started looking for a place. Not dramatically, not as an announcement. I said it the way people say things when they are already tired of explaining themselves. I've made a few inquiries, I said, standing in the kitchen with my coat still on. Just small flats, nothing far. Claire froze mid-movement. Daniel looked up from the table as if he hadn't heard me correctly. What do you mean, inquiries? He asked. I took off my coat slowly and hung it on the chair. I had learned, over months, that sudden movements invited interruption. I mean, I'm planning to move out, I said, in the next few months. The silence that followed was sharp enough to feel physical. Daniel stood up first. His voice was controlled, but there was strain in it. Mum, this is sudden. It isn't, I said. It's just the first time I've said it out loud. Claire crossed her arms. Is this about the money conversation? It's about everything, I replied. She sighed, the kind of sigh that carries impatience rather than exhaustion. We were trying to be responsible. I know, I said, and I was trying to be invisible. It turns out neither of those things work very well together. Daniel rubbed his temples. You're taking this the wrong way. No one is pushing you out. No, I said quietly. You're just making it very clear what it costs to stay. That was the moment Claire spoke without filtering herself. This isn't a hotel, she said. We have a child, a life. We need structure. I nodded, and I am not part of that structure. I understand that now. Daniel looked at her, then back at me. She didn't mean it like that. She did, I said, and that's all right. What isn't all right is pretending I haven't noticed. Claire's voice hardened. We welcomed you into our home. You accommodated me, I said. There's a difference. Her eyes narrowed. So what, now we're villains? No, I said. You're just honest. Finally. Daniel raised his voice then. Just slightly. You're being unfair. I looked at him, really looked at him, at the man I had raised to be considerate, careful, decent, at the man who had learned that avoiding conflict was the same as kindness. I have spent months being fair, I said, fair to your routines, fair to your marriage, fair to your comfort. All I'm asking now is that you be fair to my dignity. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Claire shook her head. This feels manipulative. That word landed harder than anything else that night. I felt my chest tighten. But my voice did not waver. Manipulation is staying silent so no one feels guilty. I did that. I'm done. Sophie appeared in the doorway. Are you leaving? She asked. The question was direct. Children often are. I walked over to her and knelt down. Not right away, I said, and not because of you. Never because of you. She nodded, then asked, did I do something wrong? No, I said firmly. You did nothing wrong. You never have. Behind me, I heard Claire inhale sharply. Daniel said Sophie's name, gently, guiding her back toward the stairs. After she left, something in the room broke open. You're overreacting, Claire said. People your age should be grateful to have family. That sentence, I said slowly, is exactly why I'm leaving. Daniel stared at the floor. Mum, please, we can talk about this. We've been talking, I said. You just didn't realize I was listening. I told them about the dinners I missed. The conversations that stopped when I entered. The way decisions were made as if I were temporary. I told them about waking early to stay out of the way. About eating alone. About learning to measure my presence. I didn't want to be special. I said, I just wanted to exist without apologizing. Claire laughed once, short and humorless. So what? We're supposed to change everything? No, I said, I am. Daniel finally looked at me then. Really looked. Is this because you're lonely? Yes, I said, but not for the reason you think. I stood there, a woman of 66 years, explaining to her adult son that loneliness can exist in a full house. That being surrounded is not the same as being held. That staying can sometimes be more isolating than leaving. Susan arrived later that night. Daniel had called her. She didn't sit down. She stood near the door, coat still on, like she was prepared to leave quickly if things turned uncomfortable. This is nonsense, she said. Families compromise. I did, I replied. She looked at Claire, then back at me. You're being dramatic. I'm being honest. She scoffed. At your age, you should be thinking about care, not independence. That was the line that stayed with me. At my age, I said, I have already given most of my life to other people. What I have left is not negotiable. Daniel said my name, sharply this time. Stop. I turned to him. No, you stop. Stop letting everyone speak for me. Susan's voice softened. You're hurting him. I know, I said, and I'm sorry, but I am not responsible for protecting him from the truth. The room felt small then. Too small to hold what was happening. Claire broke the silence. If you leave, don't expect things to be the same. I met her eyes. They aren't. Daniel asked, quietly, is this final? I took a breath. I thought of my old house. Of the silence that had scared me. Of the silence here that had erased me. Yes, I said, it is. No one cried. No one shouted after that. The confrontation didn't end with chaos. It ended with clarity. I went to my room and closed the door. For the first time since moving into that house, I did not feel like a guest. I felt like a woman who had finally chosen herself. The family did not collapse that night, but something irrevocable shifted. Roles rearranged, illusions fell away. And as I lay in bed, listening to the house settle around me, I understood that leaving would cost me comfort, routine, and proximity. But staying would cost me myself. That was a price I was no longer willing to pay. Leaving did not happen all at once. It unfolded slowly, in small practical steps, the way most real separations do. I stayed for 3 more weeks. Not because anyone asked me to, but because entangling a life takes time. I packed a little each day. Books first, then clothes I hadn't worn in years. Objects I had kept simply because there had always been space for them before. Now I measured everything by what I could carry without help. Daniel avoided me during that time. He was polite, careful. He asked if I needed anything, but not in a way that invited conversation. Claire became efficient. She helped me look at listings once, then never mentioned it again. The house returned quickly to its usual rhythm, only quieter around the edges where I used to be. Sophie hugged me the night before I left. She said she would miss me. She said she liked it when I told stories before bed. I promised to call her. I meant it. When the taxi arrived, no one cried. Daniel carried my suitcase to the boot. Claire stood in the doorway. Susan did not come. The car pulled away, and the house disappeared from view faster than I expected. My new flat was small. A 1-bedroom place in a building with no lift and narrow stairs. The walls were thin. The windows rattled slightly in the wind. The furniture was borrowed or second-hand. But it was mine. Every sound belonged to me. The first nights were the hardest. I woke often, unsure where I was. The quiet pressed differently here. It did not feel like rejection. It felt like space, still unfamiliar, still sharp at times. I learned new routines. I learned the shops nearby. I learned which hours felt longest and which passed quickly. I learned that grief doesn't disappear when circumstances change. It simply changes shape. There were moments when I questioned myself. When loneliness crept in and whispered that endurance might have been easier. When I imagined the warmth of the old kitchen, the noise of a full house, I reminded myself that warmth without belonging is not warmth at all. Time moved forward whether I was ready or not. I began taking walks in the mornings. At first, just around the block, then further. I found a small park with benches that caught the afternoon light. I sat there often, watching people pass without needing to interact. I realized how long it had been since I'd existed without being evaluated. My health improved in small ways. I slept better. I ate when I was hungry, not when it was convenient. I stopped flinching at footsteps outside my door. I stopped explaining my choices before anyone asked. Daniel called after a month. Then again a few weeks later. The conversations were awkward but civil. He asked if I was settling in. I said I was. He sounded relieved, or maybe resigned. We did not revisit the argument. Some truths, once spoken, don't need repetition. Claire did not call. I did not expect her to. Sophie sent drawings. I taped them to my wall. They made the space feel less empty, more lived in. As the seasons shifted, so did something inside me. The urgency faded. The need to justify softened. I no longer replayed conversations at night. I no longer rehearsed explanations for a life that was already in motion. I began to enjoy small freedoms. Choosing what to eat, when to sleep, how loud to play the radio. These were not grand victories. They were quiet confirmations that I still belonged to myself. There were difficult days. Days when money felt tight. Days when my body reminded me of its age. Days when I missed the illusion of family closeness more than the reality of it. I let those days pass without forcing optimism. Healing, I learned, is not about replacing loss with joy. It's about learning how to carry absence without letting it define you. I did not become stronger in a dramatic way. I became steadier. One afternoon, months later, I received a message from Daniel. He said Sophie had asked if I could come for dinner sometime. He said they missed me. He did not add conditions. He did not apologize. He simply asked. I told him yes, on my terms. I said I would come for a few hours. He agreed. When I arrived, nothing felt entirely comfortable, but nothing felt heavy either. I sat at the table. I spoke when I wanted to. I left when I was ready. No one tried to manage me. On the way home, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Relief. Not because everything was fixed, but because I was no longer waiting to be accepted. Life after the upheaval was not easier, but it was quieter in the right ways. The kind of quiet that allows you to hear yourself again. I learned that self-healing does not arrive with answers. It arrives with permission. Permission to take up space. Permission to leave rooms where you are only tolerated. Permission to choose dignity over convenience. And as I sat alone in my flat one evening, tea warming my hands, city lights glowing outside the window, I understood something that had taken me a lifetime to learn. Loneliness does not mean you are alone. Sometimes it means you have finally stopped abandoning yourself. The turning point came quietly, the way most real changes do, not as an emergency, not as a crisis that demanded urgency, but as information that rearranged what I thought I understood. It arrived through a letter. Daniel forwarded it to me with a short message asking if I had a moment to read it. It was from the hospital. Routine language, polite phrasing. Claire had been unwell for some time. Apparently, tests that had gone on longer than expected. Nothing immediately life-threatening, but serious enough to disrupt the careful order she had built her life around. I read the letter twice, then sat very still. For a long time, I had told myself that leaving had been the hardest part, that the pain was behind me. But in that moment, I realized something else was being asked of me. Not endurance, not silence, but clarity. Daniel called later that evening. His voice sounded thinner than I remembered. He told me Claire had been struggling quietly for months. Fatigue, anxiety, a fear of losing control over things she had always managed effortlessly. He said she hadn't wanted anyone to know, not even him, at first. He didn't ask for help directly. He never does, but he said Sophie was confused, that the house felt unsettled, that Claire had asked about me. That last part surprised me. A week later, I went to see her. She was sitting in the living room when I arrived, wrapped in a blanket despite the mild weather. She looked smaller than before. Not weak, exactly, just stripped of the certainty she used to wear so naturally. She smiled when she saw me, but it didn't reach her eyes. We sat opposite each other. No one else in the room. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said my name, carefully, as if testing whether it still belonged to her. I didn't realize how much I was holding. She said, until I couldn't anymore. I listened. She told me about the pressure she lived under, about needing things to make sense, to be predictable, about growing up in a house where chaos had been constant, where control was the only thing that made her feel safe. She said when I moved in, it disrupted something she hadn't known was fragile. She paused, then said something I hadn't expected. I thought if I managed everything properly, no one would fall apart. I recognized that belief. It was different from mine, but just as heavy. She didn't apologize immediately. Instead, she described the distance she had created without realizing it, the way she had mistaken efficiency for care, boundaries for protection. She admitted she had been afraid of becoming irrelevant, afraid of losing authority in her own home, afraid that one day, she might be the one needing space made for her. I did not interrupt. When she finished, she looked at me and said, I see now that I treated you like something that needed to be managed. I nodded. That's how it felt. There was no argument, no defense, just acknowledgement. She asked if I resented her. I considered the question honestly. Then I said no, not anymore. I told her resentment had exhausted itself long before I left. That what remained was grief. Not for what had happened, but for what might have been possible if we had spoken earlier. She cried then, quietly, without drama. I did not comfort her physically. I did not need to. I stayed present. That was enough. Before I left, she asked if I could visit Sophie more often. Not to help, not to take over, just to be there. I said yes. On the way home, I felt something settle inside me, a release I hadn't known I was still carrying. Understanding does not erase harm, but it changes how you hold it. I did not leave that house feeling vindicated. I left feeling finished. Finished needing to explain myself. Finished waiting for recognition. Finished carrying roles that no longer fit. Some wounds do not heal because someone apologizes. They heal because we finally understand where the pain came from and choose not to carry it forward. That was the moment I let go. By the time everything settled, I understood that life does not always offer closure in the way we imagine. There was no single moment where all the pain dissolved. No perfect balance restored. What arrived instead was something quieter and far more sustainable. Acceptance. I stopped replaying the past. Stopped wondering how different choices might have changed the outcome. I stopped measuring my worth against how useful or convenient I was to others. The questions that once kept me awake no longer demanded answers. They simply lost their urgency. Claire's illness did not turn her into a different person. It softened her edges, yes, but more importantly, it revealed the fear beneath her control. Seeing that did not excuse what happened between us, but it allowed me to place the pain where it belonged. Not inside myself, not as a personal failure, but as the result of two very different ways of surviving the world. Daniel and I learned to speak more honestly after that. Not more often, just more clearly. There was less avoidance in his voice, less need to smooth things over. We did not rebuild the old closeness, but we found something steadier. Respect without obligation, care without possession. And Sophie remained Sophie, curious, observant, growing in ways that no adult conflict could fully shape. When she visits me now, she runs through my small flat as if it has always been part of her life. She does not ask why I live alone. She accepts it as fact. Children often understand peace more easily than adults. As for me, I learned something I wish I had known earlier. That dignity is not something others grant us when we behave well enough. It is something we protect by knowing when to step away. That belonging does not always come from staying. Sometimes it comes from choosing yourself, even when that choice is quiet and unseen. Forgiveness, I discovered, is not a reward we give to those who hurt us once they have proven themselves worthy. More often, it is a boundary we draw for our own sake, a way of laying down a weight we no longer need to carry. Sometimes forgiveness is not because the other person deserves it. Sometimes it is because we deserve peace. If this story felt familiar to you, if it stirred something you've lived or are still living, you are not alone. This space exists for those moments of recognition, for stories that do not shout, but linger. If you'd like to continue reflecting on life, family, and the quiet choices that shape us, you're welcome to stay with Contemplate Life. Before we part, I want to leave you with one question to sit with. Is there a place in your life where you are still enduring quietly, when what you truly need is permission to let go? Thank you for listening. Take care of yourself. And until next time, goodbye.